We gotta check out.
And then was on that too.
Everybody.
Yeah.
So that's what we're gonna do.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I think it was kind of interesting. Study, Excel does a lot of cool things with graphs, and once you plug in the numbers, you let the machine work for it.
Yeah. Kind of like a microwave.
There's some more people coming on. All right. We will give it a few more
Got
seconds.
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes and let the people come in from the parking lot and we'll go ahead and get started.
I think they're coming in back on the beach.
Well, we'll see. Well, I had an under over of 12, so we are right on. Counting us. Stuart.
It's like we're going to tie.
Yeah.
You're counting yourself?
Yes, that's always appropriate. When you're in the back.
That's fair.
There you go.
So if we go over 12, I win, and under 12, you win.
Oh, yeah. As you can see which side I was on. I
And
think
Jennifer
interest
doesn't
level
count.
was 0.
Jennifer stacks that she doesn't count, right?
Well, I don't know.
Then you lose.
Then I
We're at
lose, that's
13.
true. Okay, then I won't count Jennifer.
That means you're buying. And I have very expensive pay.
There you go.
There's our atomic clock. You're-
That's true.
Yeah, I think these folks are, I feel all gonna leave, so.
I think we got all we're gonna get. So I don't know, Stuart, do you think I won the bet or?
I think it's a push because there's 12
It's a
people in
push.
the room.
All righty. Well, thank you for the 12 that came on out today. And it really is important because this is the start of just putting the Springs a little bit on notice of where we're at. And then going forward, the discussions the next 2 to 3 months just kind of lays the groundwork of where we need to go. So let's see, get this started. All righty. There's going to be, like I prefaced this a few moments ago, there's going to be about 20 or so slides that we're going to go through. Try to go, I know there's a lot of history in the room. People have a lot to add to the different ones. Try to refrain to the very end and we'll go
Have a
through.
winner or a loser.
Oh, I guess I lost my bet. All right, I owe Stuart some Chianti then.
Bruce, Chris is on you.
Alrighty. So we were going to go ahead, go through just more basic accounting to start, just so everybody lays the groundwork, so the terminology of what we're talking about. So everybody knows the different verbiage. We'll then go into more specifics of the Springs financials and then the path forward of how we're going to go. Before I even start though, I have to say a big shout out though to Jennifer and Joni, who have just been integral in providing all the information. You really cannot find any of this in a ledger that they give us in audit and finance. You have to dig deeper. You have to go into the computer. You have to look through all the different systems that are buried and buried and buried. And it really is just impossible for anybody in this audience, even a board member, to really get to the bottom of this. Without their help, we wouldn't even be this close to understanding it. Also, audit and finance, everybody, Bob Johnson, Ruth, Mim, Stuart, all of us, we've gone through this. Everybody's in agreement. This is the path we're really looking at. And then obviously Ron Mizell, Ron Kenny, all the other people that have a lot of history who have really pushed things forward. We're then going to go through, look at the current financials going forward, take a look. The first big concept you have to understand, and this is probably why we have the most issues in the Springs, is the accrual versus check-based accounting. Check-based accounting is where cash method is more or less you go out there, you earn some money, you get your paycheck, you put it in the bank, you know how much money you have in the bank, you go to the store, you buy something, you pay the bill, and there you go. It's an instant transaction. At any moment in time, you see exactly what you have. Accrual-based accounting is what an HOA has to do. It's somewhat state mandated. It's the recommended path that you want to do. No, sorry, you're definitely winning now. And that's actually when you record revenue when it's earned, not received. So just think about what happens. Vouchers go out in November, December. 600,000 might come in. So in your checking account, you'll see $1 million. But the reality is on the books, it'll only say 108. Well, it won't even record it. January, it'll say 180,000 that you actually received. So if you look at what's in your checking account, you think, gosh, I'm really flush. This is great. We only received 180. We're going to expect this much. That's not what happens. So accounting ledgers are meant to keep track of your liabilities, your assets, and how a big corporation runs, the moving pictures. But to actually run a business, you can get really in trouble if you look at that and try to run it. There's no placeholders. You can't really look at your checking account and say, this is how much money I have to spend, because you don't know what bills are really out there. It hasn't been applied yet. So you have to be very careful. And everything we look at in audit and finance is a ledger on the accrual. We don't have the cash, we don't have an instant working document. Everybody knew what it was, and people that are accountants know how to transition that, but an average person wouldn't be able to just look at a book and see that. So this is probably the most important slide of everything today. And do you care if I take my mask off? Are you okay? So you can actually hear me. I have a feeling it's rather muffled on this camera. This is really probably the most important slide, because we actually operate under think of it as two sides of the Springs budget. You have an operating budget and reserves, and you'll hear that quite frequently. In every meeting, we'll say reserves, we'll say operating. All the money we bring in, all the income, things like that, will go into operating. And from that operating budget, you then fund all your expenses, and one of the expenses is the reserves. What's a little bit new of this year and such, they're really cracking down. We're in unrestricted reserves. We didn't have to put X number of dollars for an X defined project until recently. Now what the accountant, and I've been working with him, the auditor, for the last month or so, they're starting to make us more like a hybrid. We have to identify within the reserves a set number of projects. And in good faith, we have to fund those projects. So in that sense, we're becoming, in a quote unquote, we have to have a capital replacement fund. It cannot be a slush fund. In the past, if an emergency happened, like let's say the bridge needed to be repaired, you could then say, we're going to call that a capital thing. We're going to take that money. They won't allow you to do that now. Once the money goes into reserves, it can't come out of the reserves to pay for an emergency occurrence. Anything that's maintenance, anything that's an emergency, that's sinkhole, can't come out of reserves. It has to come out of operating. In theory, what happens is you have an operating budget, and what historically happened here is your income minus expenses is then you have at the end of the year, you take a look at it. In theory, when you make your budget, it's a net zero. What's happened in the Springs is we've always kind of had a little bit extra, and that little bit extra was buried in the checking account, and that's your operating surplus, and that's your emergency fund. So if you ever had the sinkhole, if you have the pothole that's a little bit over and above, that's where the money came from. So it's not something we've ever budgeted, it's your surplus. So you have two running budgets, you have your operating, your reserves, and then this kind of hidden thing under there pays for all your emergencies. So now your operating, once again, expenses, it's actually broken up to 7 different categories. And within those 7 categories, there's actually 121 line items that we actually break the budget into. So when I look at, and what some would say, and this has been common for the most part, we've been around for 50 years. The budget's relatively stable. So within each line item, you'll have a placeholder. So if you're a little above here, a little under here, really within those 6, you want to go ahead and hit it. The reserves itself is, like I told you, it's actually an expense that goes over. And so the reserves, the way about a year ago, and you can see it started back in early spring, finalized in November, is the reserve study. And you'll see that quite frequently mentioned. What that did was identify, there's probably close to maybe about 30 different items in there. And that's where they identify paving the roads, putting windows in, putting improvements on the spa, the pool, reinforcing this. There's about 20 different items in there that we're constantly saving for. And this is an outline then of how to go about doing that over the next 30, 40 years. All right, any questions so far? This is the best, this is the accounting part of it. This is the basic, not anything to do with the Springs. Everybody understand?
Okay, in the change in how you operate,
Yes.
is that by Florida law or recommendation of the accountant or the attorney?
It's a combination of everything. If you look at statute 720 for this year, under the restrictive portion of it, or the reserves, it'll start interchangeably saying whether you're restricted or unrestricted, this is now what we want to see you do. And according to the auditor, he said the movement is such that it's going to get tighter and tighter. And as long as we've identified what we want by a reserve study, we've done our due diligence that way, and we're funding appropriately and not underfunding on purpose, we can't just do it on paper. We have to do it in reality. He says you'll be well within the norm. So over the next couple of years, you won't have to make any other changes. He feels that we'll still be able to maintain our grandfather status. Does that make sense?
Can I ask,
Before we go to the specifics?
can I ask you to just go back to the slide that showed the expenses, like the common area maintenance grounds? I didn't write all those down. I just would like to see that if
Go back one.
possible.
Oh, okay, sure.
One more right here.
Oh, sorry.
Nope.
There you go.
Okay,
Okay.
give me just a sec to,
Nope, and remember too, all these slides will be made available in the office. And so once we go ahead, this is a working document. This is what it is on April in 2021. And all of a sudden, May and June, it may evolve a bit, but this is where we're at. So if you need anything specific, we'll go ahead and have that available, okay?
okay, thank you.
Sure,
I have
Sure.
one more question. I'm
Mhm.
sorry.
no problem.
Is this reserve study complete? Because when I was at a few meetings, it appeared that the board was saying it was incomplete. Is this a completed reserve study?
It's
With all the components of the property?
it's a completed study as per what we paid for. What,
Which
now
means
this is
it's
once
not
again,
complete.
it's like when you say, do we have money or do we have no money? It's
Right.
where the semantics is. The study itself is complete. When I've looked at it and people who know this community very well, we feel like there's a few items they left off, and there's probably some items they kind of went on, they lowballed a bit. So if you actually want to say it's a complete study, yes, it's a great ground floor of a 2-story building. This is a great start to make us in a good spot. Excuse me?
What are you projecting dollar-wise?
I'll go through if you, that's a really good question. And when we come back to the end, I'm going to circle to that. And that's what you'll see in my path forward. So this is just basics, not on the specifics of the springs yet.
You're gonna need to repeat the questions because they can't hear. the
Oh,
questions
I'm
over
sorry.
the-
Sure. Okay, so let's go back. All right, so like I started, you have an accrual-based counting. This is what all these ledgers will give you. And that's what audit and finance has. From my practice, when I worked as, I was an anesthesiologist, but also very active in the administrative portion of my practice. So for about 10, 15 years, I was a treasurer, ran everything, and worked with an accountant once a month, merging books. We don't have that luxury here, but I did recognize the fact is you need an operating budget that you can actually see from a moment by moment. So one of the first things I did is work very closely with Jennifer and Joni and start taking a look at where are we. Unfortunately, once I started, within about a week, I checked my calculator to make sure I was right, and I was a little concerned of how the numbers were coming into play. Went back 5 years to see, okay, what's the trend line, to see if I was just seeing a barren type thing. And then I went forward 5 years because I do know that the loan is going to be paid off in 2023, where we're going to be gaining 100,000 a year in our budget. So I wanted to make sure this wasn't a one-off, and before I started to really dive in forward. And this is what the trend line shows. So if you look back in 2016, if you go forward in time to the projected in 2026, that's our projected income. The orange line is what our, on the left of the red dot is the absolute expenses of how we've been spending money. To the right is the projected. 2021, that is as of an April of 2021. It's probably maybe go up a little bit higher, unfortunately. It's an odd looking graph. And so one of the things I looked at is then, all right, what does the income stream mean? In January 17th is when the last time our dues were increased. That's from 1,600 to 1,780. The RV, stables, clubhouse, they all got raised in the 19 and then the 20s. So when you go back and look at this graph, you can see between 16 and 17, that explains the big income jump you see there. Between 18, 19, and 20, there's a little bit of a rise, and that accounts for a little bit of the increase of the RV, the stables. But what 19 and 20, which doesn't show, is that there was a couple of very large accounts that settled. There were people that owed 20, 30, 40,000 that all of a sudden settled in those years. Those are something that won't happen again, and we don't have that type of reserve AR sitting there. So that's a one-off. So when you look at then going forward, 21 up to 26, we're really returning back to the 2017, 2018 levels. But yep.
Just a question, when you say that, if we're on an accrual basis,
Mhm.
then those.
Well,
funds
no,
that
but
are paid-
actually, I'll come back to that, but remember, this is now not an accrual accounting. This is, if you take the numbers and you say, what do I have in the checking account to spend at the end of the year? What am I actually going to have to spend in a line item? That's where these graphs, going forward, these are all not the accrual books now. This is all taking all that money and really turning it into a cash base. So
You're
there
doing
is,
cash flow projection.
correct, this is 100%. From this point forward, this is not going to be the accounting version. This is what we're actually working with. And that changes things a bit.
Okay, I just
Yep.
wanted to clarify, because I thought we were talking accrual and then.
Nope, that's why I said this is where I transitioned into it.
Yep,
Mhm,
that's
Yep,
fine.
yep. And so at this point, you kind of look at it. All right, so now we got to take a closer look at expenses and closer look at then what is our income from this point. Taking a look, if you look at when they made the budget in 2020, some of the things that were a little bit interesting. This is the projected income of 2021. But if you look at the pattern from 2016 to 2020, even with a little bit of an increase in the RV, it's relatively stable. But when they made the budget, it's a little bit of an optimistic. They're saying that you're going to come in at 32,000. Historically, we've never made till 25,000. So it already starts you off at a little bit of an income shortfall from the very beginning. The clubhouse wasn't so bad, and this is actually COVID related. We actually do very well at the clubhouse. This is highly a desired spot. We really underfund and charge people. It's a great deal for residents. And so for them, once COVID is over, I have no doubt this is going to rebound. This was a little bit of an interest, and this is once again because income has to equal expenses when you make the budget. And you can see that they had to over project once again that we're going to bring in 22,000. In the history of our place, we've never made more than 5,000 on this miscellaneous. So when you go look at this, you're kind of like, okay, we have some big deficit differences, but does it matter? And the reality is it really doesn't matter. Those small little differences I just showed you is only 5% of our budget. 95% of our budget comes in by assessments. So it really doesn't explain that big mismatch we're seeing on the graph. So this is where then I started to let's look at expenses. So part of the problem that you see, and this is just another way to look at that first graph I showed you. When you take income minus expenses, this is what your surplus is. This is where, remember, if you talk about the very first slide, I said, once you have a surplus, that's your underlining that you live off of. You could see even when they raised the dues back in 2016, 2017, they were eating away at the surplus. And one of the reasons that was starting to really get accelerated is, like I said, they were no longer able to use the reserves as a little bit of a savings account of sorts. They couldn't take it for those emergencies anymore. Once the money was in there, it had to stay. So you had to start to eat away then at your surplus. As you can see, this year, tough year, it comes up a little bit. Now, 22 to 26, I only did budgeted items. I didn't put any emergency that occurred. Now, sinkholes, so I'm assuming for those next 5 years, we won't have one, which is not the history of what we've seen. That hasn't occurred. All right, what that translates though, is now there goes your emergency fund. When you're now working in the deficit, when you have no emergency fund, what are you actually then paying the bills with? So once you're under budget, as an HOA, you can't go get a line of credit from a bank. You can't go do these type of things. And this is why we're actually here on a Saturday morning, because you can't sustain this. The trend line, it's not unique to something that happened last year. That if you see over 5 years, we came up and we're just on a projected path. And when you look at the numbers and project forward, it was inevitable. And it's just at the point where we have to actually do something. So, all right, so now, what's driving? It's a 50-year-old community. We are at that point where we have been working on what we call a maintenance basis. It's very predictable. I went back 5+ years and graphed every 100 some line items, and it was a beautiful kind of a flat line. You can really predict our budget. It's within pennies. And it made no sense to me when I looked at that. But then when you actually dive in, and I'll show you a few examples, it's just that we're great until we have that emergency. And that's where the problem comes in is number two, the emergency repairs are not funded in the budget. So we're relying on an expected surplus that now we've kind of hit the point where we don't have that surplus anymore. You have future projects that were approved in 2020 that weren't budgeted. Some of those were emergency projects, like the bridge. That's, you know, 50-some thousand dollars. You can't just all of a sudden expect a maintenance budget to accommodate that when we're doing equals to equal things. Overly optimistic income projections and underestimating known expenses are also contributing to all this. And those kind of just mask the problem a little bit. Do you have any questions at this part so far? Everybody good? Understand?
I just want to thank you for having put it so clearly.
Oh.
You've done a great job.
Okay, yeah, I was trying to, I didn't want to do numbers. I want to do pictures and that, so, all righty. And so now we have to go ahead and see, where are we going? So this is just one example of what happens. So you basically have a nice stable, the orange, once again, is what we budget. The blue is what happens. And so you can see we're good until we're not. And when we're not, look what happens. $60,000 you have to all of a sudden find in a budget that has almost nothing to find in. Once you look at the next one, road repairs, same thing. We're fine until all of a sudden the bridge needs to be repaired. All of a sudden we're doing a riverside, but we got all these projects that just all of a sudden show up that aren't budgeted. How do we then pay for it? This is actually another driver that really is becoming a big problem is the insurance. Even though we've somewhat accelerated or what we feel like the budget should be, we're still not even budgeting enough of what we're paying out. So even that's a mismatch. So this is just another of all, you know, what we actually see. I can go through examples, but these are just three that really show what are the drivers. So at this point, I talked to Joni and talked to the board, talked to audit and finance, had a big meeting and says, how are we going to right the ship? Where do we need to go from here? First thing I tried to do is find any spending at all. Can we find anything discretionary we can cut from this year's budget? Where can we go? This I thought was probably the most fascinating of everything is we have 75% of our budget we can't touch. You have payroll, and when you look at the salaries, they are spot on. They're for their level of experience and the number of people we have, there's nothing that can go down in that one, if anything. For your century management, it's going to be some pennies you may be able to look at, and it's more out of principle, but that's right there. It's a necessary thing. You need them to do your accounting books. You have office supplies, that's all kind of lumped into the office, utilities, insurance, reserve funding, which you absolutely, once again, like I said, we know what the capitals are, and if anything, we're actually underfunding this at this point. That's 75%.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
So the payroll obviously is the biggest, you know, piece of the pie there. Do we know total how many people are on payroll?
Repeat the question.
Sure. The question was, how many people are on payroll? We have 3 office staff. We have, I believe, 5 maintenance, and then four maintenance, and the CSOs, 12.
Oh, that one's
Yeah, 12.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's really, you can tell by the CSO number of how much overtime they may need to have. So that's how you know the sweet spot on funding are there.
Okay.
4 people of maintenance is a very large community.
Yeah.
3 office staff, there's not much you can do about that.
Right.
Mhm.
I was just curious.
And then also too, most time payroll will only be like 30, 40, like it's a little bit high on the percentage, but remember this is your denominator. So one can almost extrapolate back that we're not spending enough on that other 25% because we should be actually spending more on our infrastructure and our common ground maintenance. That would actually shrink it because we know the payroll number is correct.
Right.
The other numbers actually should have been a little bit higher for a community like this, but that's how tight we're running the budget. So they're really, and the miscellaneous and discretionary 0.9%, that's your Easter egg hunts,
Right.
that's the, you know, decorations, really not much. And I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Yeah. So it really isn't to that. Any other questions on here? Yep.
I'm a little behind.
Sure.
How much money is Century Management paid for this I know there's other HOAs, but
Sure.
Repeat
They're
the
actually,
question.
yep. How much is Century Management paid? When you have a management company, what they're paid is actually broken into different pockets. So we pay them a set rate. It's about 40,000 or so. And that's how they keep our books. We send them invoices, they manage the ledgers, they prepare taxes. We have our office employees and our maintenance employees are actually Century employees. So they run and take care of their benefits, their training, that sort of thing. The only people we actually employ at the Springs is the guards, the CSOs. So we have those as their own employees. That's
There's-
part of it.
No, go ahead, finish.
Yeah.
There's a question on.
Oh, sure. We also then, anytime you have our management company, there's something called a burden rate. So the burden rate is a percentage of the employees that Century has, they provided us. There's a percentage we have to pay over and above their salaries and such. That's where we're a little bit lower than the standard in the area. We're at 35%. A lot of the other companies I interviewed a few years ago were at 40. So we've saved a touch of money there. The bottom part, there's a third component, and that's what I've been going back and forth with and arguing. The other two are set. There's nothing you can do about it. It's how they're billing the extraneous. When you get a letter in the mail, say you get that little voucher, for example, this quarter, everybody received a voucher. If you're on a quarter plan, you got an RV, you're on a stable, that cost us $600 to mail those vouchers out. And that's just at the quarterly basis. Those are the numbers that I just, even though it's small in a $1.6, $1.7 million budget, to me, it's just, we got to manage Century and make sure we're not being over on that third pocket. I don't want to have to then have this hidden cost. And that's what I'm arguing over. And it's more of a principle than real dollars at this point, but I think it's important to really dive into.
The Zoom
Mhm.
question is what are reserves used for?
And the reserves, actually, we will come back, and that's going to be about 3 more slides. So there are a few slides ahead. So there we go. Any other questions on this one? Mhm.
Yeah, on the RV and the stables, do we break even on that?
The RV, yes, clearly, because of just, how it is and do we want to maintain more or not. The stables, when you actually break out, remember there's 2 budgets. There's the operating budget and there's the reserve budget. On the operating side, we're close, but we're a little bit under. And obviously nothing, and because we're under there, we're not funding anything into, like, say, the roof and siding and painting. Those are, sorry, painting will be on operating, but those sort of things. So yes, we are under, and that's why the discussion, if you've been following some of the different board meetings, although it's only 5% of our budget, these other little things, the niche things are actually not important, probably for, say, like 8 people are using the stables, maybe 60 people are using the tennis courts, but to those people that are using it, it is very important. And so that's why we're trying to kind of self-monetize those subsections. So that way they can meet their expenses. And if they want to have that extra special looking gate, if they want to have some extra seating at the tennis courts and stuff, if you self-monetize that part and say, look, that little bit extra that you're bringing in that we're charging someone for, we can then use that for that special offense, and it's not coming out of the global fund that the other 850 people are spending. So it's kind of our way to help those kind of niche little things that we have. So it's a win-win for everybody, but it's not going to help the global picture of our income stream. Mhm.
First of all, I love horses, but I just want to understand. So with the stables, the next 30 years, it's going to cost us X amount of dollars to maintain those stables.
Well,
Is that
no, not
projected?
not going forward, because that's one of the things Asher and I, Kate, we've all pretty much talked about, is we want to try to get it to the point that it's close to break even. But once again, the Springs is obligated to provide certain amenities. When you move in here, you expect to have a stables, you expect to have a tennis court. Everybody has the option to use these things. So there is an obligation of our HOA to provide the basic maintenance of these. But because some of them are somewhat self-limited and some of the expenses they're asking for are more fluff, more fun, extra special, you don't want to sit in a seat that's a little rusty or plastic. You want something nicer. Those are the things the self-monetization will then give those individuals. Does that make sense?
It's not broken down over the next 30 years what the stables are going to cost us to maintain.
it's in the.
Yeah, and it's gonna, go ahead, I'll go, like, once again, all good
So it
questions. Yep, and actually what I'll do is, unless it's specific to here, like I said, at the very end, I think I'm gonna get to most of your questions then. All right, so reserves. One slide too early for that question. What the reserves actually, what you're actually saving for. But I said there's about 30 so things in there. A lot of the things that within the next 5 years that you'll actually see that you've been saving for, roads repairs, spa and the pool area, the playground, tennis, signs, roof replacement, wall and fencing, lights. These are all things that you'll start seeing within the next few years. So as we're putting money in, we're also taking money out at the same time for these capital improvements. Once again, like I said, the goal is actually to go ahead by 2033, actually paid for the roads. Last time the roads were done, we took out a loan. This time we're trying to save that 1.3, 1.4 million to get to that so we don't have to take out that loan again. And once again, remember, you don't want to overfund this since you can't take a surplus out to fix anything. The goal is to try to just break even. You want to find that sweet spot. You want to have your best estimate of what these are going to cost, fund it accordingly. If you have to put a little extra in, it's better to do that later than overfund here because you can't take it back.
One of the
So
questions is the spa repair covered by reserves?
the spa repair is not, because it's not a capital improvement, but if the repair itself is your final improvement, then it would be. So it depends upon how we define how we repair the spa and what's our overall intention. So, and that's for the spa. And that's, we'll come back at the very end on that. Once again, remember, unrestricted gives us the flexibility. When you're a 50-year-old community, it's very difficult to identify every single line item you want and every single dollar item. And that's what the difference between a restrictive and unrestricted. We got a good faith. It's almost like a hybrid. We go forward this way. Yep.
How much of the revenue stream is put into the reserves?
There you go. Look, I'm going to keep going. I'm telling you, at the end of this presentation, you will understand this. So next slide. You'll see here, reserve funding. All good questions. Once again, 2021. When the dues were raised in 2016 to 2017, one of the caveats to increasing the dues was to have a guaranteed funding for the reserves. Per month, it was $11,000. The powers that be around 2018 or so recognized that that wasn't going to cover it. It increased then to $16,800 a month, which is roughly around $200,000 a year or so. They overdid that, but at the time, like I said, in 17, 18, they thought they could take some of that money back into the surplus to fix things. And when that changed, it maintained, which is what the blue is. So this is how we're currently funding. That's why it's steady. We're actually in a really good spot. We've actually, the shining light of this is we're actually spot on. According to what the study says, we're exactly where we need to be. So this is the highlight of the top. We're right there. The problem is when you actually look at the funding of the study, it accelerates how much you put in every year. It doesn't stay stable. We stay stable in our budget. That's where the discrepancy comes in. So when I say then, can we pay for the playground right now? The answer is yes, we have the money, we saved for it. But the problem is in 5 years, we're $160,000 behind. So is it a good idea to pay for a playground now when, remember I said road repair, the improvement comes out of it, things that you absolutely, most people will see. Should you be taking it knowing we're 180 and if we haven't corrected it, we're way behind in the capital improvement budget. So that's where sometimes when you hear, do we have money? Yes. Should we be spending it now? Probably not, knowing this until we fix things. So that answer the reserve question? All right. So now we're off to, what is my assessment of this? The trajectory, as you could probably tell, I don't find very sustainable. It's not sustainable. It's been a trend that's occurring. It's not something that just happened in 1 year. Going back 5 years where you see where the trend line is and going forward, even taking into account that we're going to have the loan bring back 100,000 into the budget, it still didn't save the trajectory. The small amount of income that you can take, the discretionary, it's not offsetting the anticipated budget deficits. You could only find less than 1%. If you stretch it, you can maybe get to 3, but that's not correcting hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is what we're a deficit of this year. And then once again, unbudgeted emergency repairs are not a rare occurrence. It's now becoming the norm. So you can't rely on the surplus that doesn't exist to pay for things that you know are going to happen. They really should be budgeted in there. So we're really at that transition period at least the way I look at it is, we have to stop thinking of the budget as just being a maintaining, but being more realistic. Budget for these emergency funds, budget for the capital improvements meant for this type of community. So here is my solution, potential solution. You got to increase the assessments. It's the only place you have money. You can find the little niche. We can talk about stables. We can talk about that, and we can maybe take it from 5% to 7%. That's not where the driving factor is. That's not where you're going to make up the income expense mismatch. The industry standard is about 3 months of operating expenses below your budget. And that's historically been about $420,000. That's a little bit low now. Our 3 months is that, but it seems to be that would be a sweet spot if you do the next item, which is you create a line item expense in the operating budget for about $50,000. And as you saw, that's not, it seems like a high number, but all of that is 1 or 2 sinkholes, 1 or 2 one bridge repair. It's everything. And this is something we're consistently happening, and we see it, we've identified it. Everybody has driven on Whispering Pines or Wisteria. Now we're watching something. I could go through about 5 or 6 roads that are just on the radar that we've budgeted for some, and the others I'm having to offset to another year and hope they don't cave in before then. Also, you need to increase the reserve contribution to correct the deficit that we saw, 180,000 in 5 years. It gets worse when you go to 12 by the roads. I didn't want to put that number down. And also make it more realistic. Go back to your point. Go ahead and take a look. Bridges weren't included in the reserve study. We have a lot of bridges that actually will need to be repaired. Maybe not the repair now, but to actually really shore it up, shore up the shoreline. 10, 20 years, these are things that are going to happen. If we identify it in the budget, it doesn't have to come out of operating. It can go into there. In good faith, put some extra money into there, and that's how you go. So what I came up with the number. So under or over. No, it's actually, I thought it was
Want a
better.
drum roll?
I know. So like I said, this is based on what I know now. This, I'm going to caveat it is, I don't know what the next sinkhole is. I'm going off it. I did want to have a lot of extras. My goal was just this. I'm trying to break even. I'm not giving us any extra fluff. This is just trying to bring us back to normal. So this is not fixing $1 million. This is none of those items. This is just fixing the operating and shoring up the reserves. So this is what you get. So for a $275 increase, which brings in the average dues up to $2,055. It corrects the reserves in 12 years. My goal was not to try to fix things overnight, but make it gradual. Fix the reserves to be a constant level of funding, not an escalated, because I think that's easier to manage in a budget. It also then corrects the surplus in your underlining surplus in 5 years. You'll see that the income goes up and stays relatively steady. And a lot of the reasons is because in 24, 25, and 26, even though you have inflationary pressures, you have other things that go up, the loan comes into play. So using the loan can offset a little bit of what this increase needs to be. And so all these numbers are on a 5-year projection. The expense goes up, and it probably, and actually what I thought was kind of interesting, just because I like numbers. If you notice, our curve is actually right there. We're completely in line with what the 5-year projection is. This shouldn't be surprising once you graph this out, that we're actually going right what you'd expect it to be. And if you actually brought the 21 numbers and averaged it to where it should have been, we have a straight line. We're right where it's not shocking. The extra that you see, what that does for you then is then you get the increase. So your income minus the expenses gives you this surplus. And what the surplus then does is now this brings you back to the emergency fund over 5 years. So it's a very slow incremental increase, but it then brings you back into that number. So, and then going back to the reserves are a little bit more interesting because when you increase the funding of that, you go from like about 16.8 to about 18, 19,000. It's not a big jump that you need to do in 12 years. It goes up initially, but as you spend money, as you're paying for that playground, things that were all supposed to be in this 5-year period, you will dip down, but as long as you maintain that level of funding over the 12 years, you'll be able to pay for the road without the loan, as long as the numbers are all acceptable in that study. So All right, now, operating budget, and we have our operating budget. We give the 275, we shore that up. We have the reserves. We have capital improvements that we've been paying for. We want to keep the Springs a great place to live. This is what you're paying for, the capital improvements. The reserves study is really giving you the guideline for it. This is what everybody moves here for. Our house is our biggest equity. This is where we have a 70s type neighborhood, beautiful canopies. This is where this is our selling point. So this is where the capital improvements are really important and we need to really take a look at. So what you've actually been saving for, if we do this, here's then your numbers of what you can do in the next 5 years. So as of now, so this is the question everybody asks, how much money do we actually have to improve the spa playhouse or pool house? Remember, this 107,000 doesn't come back up again for another 20 some years. So this would be the improvement that you see as the budget. So this isn't the Band-Aid and then go ahead and do something else. This is the improvement number. Same here with the clubhouse, the office, playground. That's the 94,000 is the taking it down. That's the realistic number, rated between 89 and 94 seems to be the number I'm hearing. The pool, it's almost 50 years old. The deck is cracked. There's some plumbing underneath it that will then be able to be paid for in there. The tennis racket shot, the resurfacing, there's large cracks actually in the surface that need to be, actually the base needs to be corrected. And that actually might be a low number. That's one of those that could be a little bit more, but hopefully that will hit. And completing the sign project. So that's one of the things that everybody says, oh, was it the sign that broke the budget? No, signs came out of reserves. This was the one thing and it was actually budgeted for. This is the remaining number that hasn't been spent yet. So, all right. Now we're up to questions. Yes, Jerry.
So one of the things, and I think that's perfect, by the way, the challenge that we've had in this business is that the audit and finance committee, I think, did a wonderful job for the most part and gave a budget. And then we get into a board meeting and we buy golf carts.
Yep.
And they're not in the budget. We spend, instead of, we bought a Mac Ready golf cart, nonetheless, the ones that can go 52 miles an hour and a neighborhood that's, 25 miles an hour speed. So what provisions are there? Yeah, I think the direction of the new board, you talk about trends. I like the trend of the board. So, but how do we ensure that when your audit and finance committee comes and makes a recommendation, lays out a budget, that it doesn't hit the board meeting, and we're off building signs, building walls. I had to get that into Ron.
Yes.
I know we talked about the wall.
I will.
Those are the concerns that I absolutely think
yeah.
the reserve is what we, I personally think that's a great direction. I think that the dollars are reasonable. But how do we control the spending habit of a board?
Correct. And so essentially Gary's question is, how do we basically control spending? And I can honestly say of all the board meetings, especially last year when you were treasurer, the first thing out of your mouth is, where are we going to pay for it? Where is this? And I think the first step is recognizing audit and finance looks at accounting ledgers. We look at patterns. We look to make sure, are we within so much dollars? So audit and finance is really an audit committee that morphed into finance over time because it was the people that actually knew the dollars and cents of the community, but that's not their primary purpose. One of the things I found with Century on our ledgers is that today is April 10th. I logged in this morning and the only bank account I can see is back from March 1st. All the numbers that I'm seeing of what we've spent up to this point are reflected back to February 1st. There's no real-time numbers. There's nothing that I can, even as a treasurer, knowing that I have access to more data than anybody in this room, I still can't get a handle on what are our expenses. So that is, as Joni and Jennifer know, I am dogmatic of having an entire different spreadsheet. I've developed an entire Excel spreadsheet for them that has a working budget. I line item the account. And as you'll see, it's not a simple spreadsheet. It's a very busy spreadsheet. And so in all these different comments are placeholders. And so we know then there's that couple. And then also I'm very strict with them on what line item the expenses are put under. I don't care if one item is over budget. I want to know that because that's important to me to know then saying yes or no for the rest of the things in that maintenance budget. If we decide to go over in one line item, I know I have to then fix it somewhere else. So we're not dividing things up arbitrarily to make the numbers pretty. This is a reality. And once again, if it's, even though a line item might say we're going to spend, you know, $15,000 on a golf cart, and all of a sudden we decide to buy the truck because we see the 15,000 in there. If it's outside of parameters or what we budgeted for, and we know in November we're still going to need that golf cart, you shouldn't have done that. Just because money's in there, the budget is so tight and so clean that every assumption has to then match what you're doing. If you're voting for something, if you're doing a project outside what the assumptions were, which is made the October prior to the year coming up, so you're having to project, you're outside and you're now going over budget. And so basically the working spreadsheet is now what the office is on. And I'm actually going to talk to the board coming up, kind of show my hand a little bit, is actually start using QuickBooks in the office. Have two different budgets working. QuickBooks is a better way for them to enter their ledger. So in real time, they can see, do placeholders. It's going to be kind of one of those that you can then see. Century will still manage all the accounting, all the taxes. It's two different ways to look at the budget.
Right, and that's a great explanation, but I don't think it gets to the answer to the question. The question really, and I agree with you, previously, when I was on the board, my voting record was clearly, if it was not in the budget, I was no. The only exception that I made to that is for the tree, right?
100%.
Yeah, but, so there's a lot of things that I felt that the board should not have done. But how do we ensure if we say, I agree with your numbers, great. We'll give you an extra $300 a year, we're cool, 275, whatever, right? So how do we turn that should not into a cannot?
Yeah. So as Kate will then say, if you've been listening to the couple Zoom meetings, so attendance is always a little bit low. Hopefully people are listening at home and on the board meetings. There is now, I think, when you say agree, Kate, there is now a different mindset. People are now, the second they bring up, how many times do they look at me now and say, do we have this? And I think it started with just education. I think the problem is when you look at these numbers of $1 million plus in November, December, you think, gosh, we're so flush with cash. You don't realize that has nothing to do with that year. It's actually your income from the next year. And we get about 90% of our income by February, but we only spend about 15%. So you look so good in the beginning. You have to then plan an entire year. And it's the education of getting a board who's never seen that. And they're getting ledgers showing them, we got this great number. Why are we so worried? Why are you trying to tighten the ship? Now I think they understand how the ebb and flow of money goes. So the first step is 100% education. And I have to give you kudos. Every time I sat in that audience, I was like, you're echoing exactly what I said. And truthfully, that's why I knew to go immediately to the budget. The day after I was elected, became treasurer, I was in the office saying there is something that I need to find out because it's not making sense what I'm seeing. And so it's a great point. And I think now going forward, as younger board members come in, I think I'm making a big point. I think hopefully as long as this trajectory continues, education continues, I think we should be okay.
Yeah, and I like the reserve, and I don't want to monopolize it, so this is my point. But my concern is the board now, I think everybody likes the thing. You know, as far as financial aspect, we're not busting budgets and all that stuff. And you know, that to me is good. The designated reserve or whatever we're calling it now, it's I think a move in the right direction. But there's that emergency fund. So how do you keep this board could change next election? How do you keep, you know, like administrations change, right? So if we have a way to kind of restrict the emergency fund?
Yes. So the question is, if you put an emergency fund in the budget, how can you keep people not using that like a pig, you know, just basically a slush fund?
Right, to buy,
exactly.
You know,
and once again,
golf carts, we can talk about nets, we can talk about
exactly.
all kinds.
And I agree with you. And that's really where it comes down to whomever you elect, you have to make sure whoever that treasurer is probably going to be has to have a very good handle on both accounting and actually cash-based method accounting. And if you know both and be able to make it work and be very strict with the budget and understand and hold the office accountable that every charge goes to where it's supposed to go And you can't just use what it's defined for. That's how to do it. And then same thing in the emergency, there's a couple different things that I can expand on that I don't want to put in writing. There's not every year, I mean, chances are there will be potholes, but over time, when you make a budget like this, you would like to hope there's some times where that's not going to happen. And so once you shore up your house within 5 years, if you have that little bit of extra, then there's no reason you can't shore up the reserves. So that's one way to make up the shortfall. There's also something else that people have to understand is in 12 years, we're going to have almost 1.4, 1.6 million plus in that reserve fund. It immediately goes away with the roads, but we're building up a very big equity. One of my strategies that I'm going to present is I don't want to take out a loan for these big projects we're talking about. Anybody that's built anything, anybody that's redesigned anything, $100,000 to build a building is just not going to happen. The reality is you're not going to have a new spot at $100,000, $50,000 aside. But one of the things we have done and been very good at is saving money. So if you raise dues and you put it in there in the assessment saying you have to mandate this amount of money going in, one of the things I'm comfortable in saving is in a sense, you almost borrow from the future. So what that comes out to in numbers, and it only works now because you have 12 years to pay it back. In a sense, you're borrowing from yourself without the interest of a bank. If you raise the dues an additional $50, so instead of $275, you're at $325. You've now given yourself in another year or two, $500,000 extra to spend on a Global Springs project down here. If you go up to $375, $380, you now have $1 million within 4 years, 500, then 2 years later, another 500. You increase the amount of money going into the reserves accordingly, so that in 12 years, you're back to where you need to pay for the road. But it's a way to get $1 million without then taking a loan out of the bank. And within $1 million, you should be able to redesign here in phases, the pool, the spa, over and above that 100,000 you already saw. So I think that's more of a reasonable working budget. If you're going to go above that, it will be a loan. And remember, even though they say money's cheap, interest rates are low, you still have to pay back the loan. So your assessment has to go up because that's a line item to pay back the loan in payments. It's not a lot, but it does increase. So you have to then take that into consideration.
Okay, so you mentioned that the would increase 275. Would you be proposing that just like for 1 year, for 5 years?
It's going to be that. And then I can only, this is in April 2021. So the question is, how long would 275 be in place? The way the HOA, our document reads, is any dues increase, you have to vote for it. 3 months or 30 days later, it goes to the community for a vote. Once you have a quorum, 50% of that puts it in place. Dues can only go up in this community by that method. Dues can come down though by a vote of the board. So let's say all of a sudden, in 5 years, I actually looked at how much would salaries increase, say 3% raise. You know, I've been told by the insurance adjuster, 15% is an increase in the insurance every year for the next few years. Once you put things like that in, the 50,000 line on them, if all of a sudden in 5, 6 years, we've made our capital improvements, you know, all the sinkholes, hopefully that happen, and we're finding ourselves flush, you can always go down. Chances are, as you know, in government, almost nothing ever goes down,
Right.
but it's still well within. When you look at the standard though, around the area, when you look at what other HOAs are paying for this volume, we're still a very good deal.
Right.
And so,
And I guess
Mhm.
part of my question too is like, okay, we'll vote for the increase. When would we expect the next increase vote? Like,
Well,
would this be good for like
mhm.
5 years? Like, or we don't know for sure, but like, I think people be more willing to vote
Mhm.
for the increase if we say, look, based on the planning, we hope to not increase the dues for at least another 5 years
Correct.
or something like that.
Correct. Well, the only promise I can give is when I came up with that number, what I did was I didn't project out 5 years at our current level of expenses. I actually projected out of what I perceive the next 5 years increases. will be.
Right.
So I put the 15%
Right, okay.
insurance rate every 5 years. I gave the 3% salaries. One of the things
So you're
that
not lowballing it, so to
I
speak.
tried
You're
to get as
let's be
realistic.
Like, we know
Let's
these
put the
increases are
50
coming, so hopefully this will keep us good
No.
for the next.
I'm
you
like,
know,
I don't want to know. I don't want to come back next
several
year and
years,
say,
right, yeah.
unless something is so unpredictable, I won't know, but otherwise, this is about as good as you can get.
Right.
Like I said, you get a little bit of the savings because you're not paying that loan anymore. So that's
Right.
$100,000 savings. That 50,000 should give you that buffer so you can build up the operating surplus. So if it is a rare year, you might be able to go into, but that 50,000 should really cover for that sinkhole, for that
Right.
repair and whispering pond, that sort of thing.
Right.
So hopefully that covers you for there. You want to, it's that fine balancing out. But if you look at the trajectory, we've been very stable, best case scenario, that should maintain. And then the overage from there should hopefully then make up for the reserves.
Okay.
The problem I still have is, once again, what I alluded to the very beginning, I'm basing everything on what the reserve study told me. I did, and I didn't say this, I did put an extra $100,000 into the reserves to kind of shore it up a little bit. That's what that number also includes over 12 years. And then we could say shoring up shoreline and then the bridge itself. So that would then cover a little bit of what I think is some offsetting costs. Yep, go ahead, Charles, Howard, yeah.
Yeah, so basically your assessment, your proposal is about like just under 23 extra dollars a month. That's
Yeah, it's
way-
really
repeat the
not,
question.
yeah.
Yeah, but my question
Mhm.
is, like your estimates, would you say like the conservative estimates, would you say they're like in the middle, maybe a little optimistic of how much the cost will be over the next couple of years?
Well, what I have is, and for those that are, oh, sorry, it's just how competent am I in my expense portion of the budget? So, I mean, it's about as good as you can. I went back and I have that up here if you want to see the trend lines, and I have all the sheets here so you can actually see where I've made my assumptions. I look back for 5 years is essentially how I came up with the numbers and said, we're a 50-year-old community. At this point, you would think we would have trend lines. So I look back and said, well, gosh, for tree maintenance, how much do we really average? There's going to be the outlier, but what really is the average? Lawn service, we kind of know what that number is. Every year it goes up 4,000. I put it up 4,000. The CSOs are a little bit interesting because remember the state has also put into place the $15 minimum wage. So that is actually a big driver. So the one thing I took out of this budget is then putting in the CSOs under like a management company. That would actually increase your dues by an extra $25 a year. So if you want that, it's going to be an extra 25. I didn't put it in there because now we're over 400 and it just, if you want to do the $1 million project, it's kind of like what do you want to pay for? So that's the one thing that's not in the budget is then putting them into that category. But everything else is inflationary costs with, part of some of the things, and most of it's just stable. It's really a very stable budget, except when it isn't. And unfortunately, except when it isn't, it's becoming the norm. Right.
As you stated, the community has to vote on increases because of our documents. That's because of the 1980s lawsuit. As far as we know, we're the only community in Florida where the homeowners have to vote on increases.
Correct.
Since the statutes don't require that, we are the exception. Has there been any thought to going back to court and getting that 1980s lawsuit reversed to give the management company and the board the freedom to do what needs to be done?
Repeat the question.
So the question is, back in, was it the 1970s? Was it correct in the
Yeah, it was
70s?
early 80s.
By the 70s, early 80s, there was basically a change where we're one of the few HOAs in probably the whole state that actually has to go to the community to ask for an assessment increase. Everywhere else can just go ahead, justify it on paper and say we're doing it. This is something, and it's interesting because that approach has been made. I'm of the belief that I think people, they should be involved in the budget. They have to know where their money's going. I think people would respect the fact that, for the fact that we actually have a large number on a beautiful Saturday coming up to listen to this. Where's our money going? You have buy-in in the community. By buy-in then is really your vote. And I think if you can't sell it to the community where you're at, and it's actually pretty much a mandate of the board, going back to Gary's question, are you using the funding appropriately? And I think if they think you're actually being responsible with your money, you're not going off on flush projects, things of that. We're really trying to just maintain and expand and capital improve the things that will value everyone. we should be able to do it. We're going to be bankrupt in 2022. There's no doubt in that money. Once we hit that trajectory, we're bankrupt. There is no way to couch it. There's almost nothing you could do short of laying off people to try to couch that. So we have to do that. I'm not going to let the place go bankrupt. So if we had to go to court to do that, but I don't believe we're going to have to. I think people understand and they can see the numbers, that I think they'll see that we're being very reasonable and bringing it up to not even close to what the average HOA pays in the area. So I think we should be okay.
Can I just in 2009, we asked for a raise, the community voted down, and there was a letter that went out to the community that says, if you don't approve this, we're gonna have to lay off staff. They did not approve it, we laid off staff.
Yeah.
And we cut everything to the bone and laid off one of the security guards and one of the maintenance people. And then people said, oh my God, they were really serious. And we re-voted at a cost of $2,500 a vote. And it was passed. That's the only time in the last 20 years that we've asked for a raise and didn't get it, but it was quite painful for everybody involved when we didn't get it.
Yeah, and so, and that's the kind of, there's more of a, not so much a question, it's just the only place to make up money is then really to lay people off. That's the quickest way to come up with not going bankrupt. The other, to say one other thing. So one of the things then that also complicates the situation a bit, which is why I actually look forward so far to see where does this line cross? Where is that point that we have to be a little bit more concerned, is really now. But which is why, though, this will have to come to a vote probably this summer, because budgets get made in September, October, it has to be turned in. You have to know what that number is. You have to know, are we going to be putting how many people in the payroll? So if that gets turned down this summer, it's going to be not a good place to be, you know, on some of these employees over the holidays, because they won't have a job. Unfortunately, we'll have to lay them off. And so it's really, we're in a tough place. And so that's why it's important to be here. We're lucky that we only have one other board member here. So if Kate wants to say something at this point, please do.
I was just going to just quickly summarize and encapsulate and just make sure that it's crystal clear. So to make the budget right, to make our expenses meet our income, we're looking at 275 increase, correct?
Yes, as of with not knowing any between now and 4 months, if all of a sudden 5 sinkholes come, then it's, you know, it's off. But yes,
That's the best estimate we have right now for how to right the ship.
Correct.
But that does not include making this clubhouse bigger. It does not include building a new spa building. It does not include resurfacing the Springs pool and putting in a bigger one. It doesn't include any of that.
Correct.
That if we want to see these big, beautiful projects phased over the next 4 years, we're looking at an additional 100 on top of the 275. Best
Correct.
estimate.
The extra 100, what that does, and you can only do it at this point in time. You can't then say another 4 or 5 years from now, you know, mea culpa, oh, I wish I didn't make that decision, let's go back. You can't do that because the math only works if you do it now. Because otherwise, if you do it later, that type of, you know, borrowing from yourself in the sense under the reserves and overfunding, the number is too high and you can't reach it quick enough. And so then you are talking about a loan. So yes, you can do a very minimum. We will be able to fix, we could put some paint, we can make some tile, but you're not going to see the dramatic changes that you hear and people are envisioning.
And just to follow up on that, so that extra $100 over the course of 4 years would get us the $1 million to do a big substantial renovation to the entire rec area, right?
For the entire area, not just one building. You're not coming back for this building and then the pool. It has to go for the entire capital.
So after
project.
that, we would still have an increase.
Yeah, okay, if you want to come up, because it'll be too hard for me to
Sorry.
repeat all that. I guess the Zoom are coming in saying they can't hear it.
So after that 4 years, when we would hopefully have this beautiful new facility, everybody would be really happy with it. We would still have that increased dues in place, right?
Correct. And
So
that's
then-
one of the things that I would actually mandate with it, is that when you put the assessment increase, there is a number that you need to hit, and that would have to be the minimum. Just like they did last time, they knew in their head they had 11,000 is what they thought at that time. Now we have a study that shows it's a lot different. That minimum needs to be in place, or I won't be in favor of it, because why then put a number here, and then you can play with it and underfund, because now we've just shorted the community again. So I know what that number needs to be. That's going to be your bottom limit. You can always fund more, but there will be that part of the assessment. So the 275 plus the 100, that extra 100 would be part of what you're voting on, saying it's a mandatory to shore it up to do then the improvements.
And then we would feel that in 10 years from now, we're not going to be in this exact same position where
Correct.
we don't have the money to do significant capital improvements that are necessary.
Correct. And actually, I brought a hard copy of the reserve study. So if people want to actually see it and see the timeline of what happens over the next 5 years, this is actually what it's telling you you're going to be able to do. This is at 5 years. So there are significant improvements that are going to happen regardless if we shore up our operating. That 275 will allow you to do this in the next 5 years. So it's not that we're not going to have any capital improvements. It's just not what we hear in the community that they would like to. And for a community like this, it's desirable. Our housing prices are going up. You got to have this. This is the area that everybody sees. Everybody has individual villages or a single home. The Springs is what really keeps us up. And that's what's really important. Go ahead, Gary and Duffy.
So just to clarify, you made a statement, and I'm not so sure that it's accurate. You said in 2022, if we didn't do this, the Springs would be bankrupt. And the only liability that I'm aware of that we have is this loan where there's about 300,000 outstanding. And as I understand bankruptcy, it's just that you can't meet your liabilities. So I think it would be more correct to say that based on your projections, we may have insufficient cash flow to fund all of the other things, not necessarily bankruptcy, but we won't, clearly not bankruptcy, but we would not have sufficient cash to cover the budget that you outlined.
But not that I outlined, it's what our current budget is. And the problem is when you look back at the current budget.
But the question is about bankruptcy.
No, but right, exactly.
Yeah.
But when you look at what our current budget actually funds, almost everything, you got to pay insurance. You have a necessary minimum under the reserves. You got to pay, put the lights on. There's almost nothing. We can stop cutting the grass.
No,
We can lay people off.
And to Ron's earlier
Exactly.
point, back in when they decided to cut operating, it was, no, we don't really want to do that. We didn't. But
But no, what I'm saying is at the current, then I'll do the statement again. At our current level of very minimum funding, we don't have an emergency fund, we don't have anything, just to meet bare bones expenses that we really don't have any discretionary funding. At our current income level, we are not going to be able to meet it. And we're actually historically diving into every year, we're actually diving into, I'll go to this one. We're actually diving into the surplus to pay the dues. So if you look back in 2017, 2018, that's actually how we've been making our expenses. It's just that we run out of that emergency right around now, assuming next year, assuming nothing else happens, no sinkhole, we don't have the ability to go get that money. So for us then to not be in bankruptcy, we're going to have to make dramatic changes then in the expense side. And it's not that I'm going to let that happen, but it's going to be pretty draconian and we're going to see a lot of things change. And it's really unnecessary when we have an ability to change it right now in a very easy way.
Bankruptcy when we only have $300,000 in liabilities. That's the point. Is it's just that you have a shortfall on operating budget and emergency budget or whatever. But you're not in bankruptcy.
I think the bankruptcy word scared.
Yeah.
But I think if I understand what you're saying, we have enough money, keep the lights on, keep the guards paid, but basically nothing else is going to get fixed. Like my collapsing street on Rain Street, that stuff just won't get fixed, which is what occurred in the 90s here, which made the Springs a very undesirable place through the 90s and put us in the hole we've been in for the last 20 years.
But remember too, bankruptcy is a term that I'm using if we continue on the path of making no changes. I won't let that, but.
Right, but bankruptcy just means you're not meeting your liability.
Correct, and what I'm saying is if you continue to spend at the rate we're doing, you are then exceeding. But then again, I mean, there's play in that, like this is just a semantic and you're exactly right. You can budget, you can do different things. But essentially what this means is exactly what Ron says. You are going to have to make some draconian cuts to go ahead
I agree.
and try to get the income and expenses to get back in line, and it's not sustainable. Go ahead, Howard.
Do you think that on top of this assessment increase, we might have something separate where we like fund the rest of the things, like a special assessment? In addition to this one?
Repeat the question.
Okay, should we have a special assessment on top of this? At this point, I would say, given what people are talking about, what their expectations are for the area, I think that these numbers are pretty good. For the next 4 to 5 years, I think this could meet it. When you get outside, and like I said, when you get closer to that 2033, 2034, where that road's gonna be built and we don't have that money to go into, that's why now's your only point. If you wanted to do something special, all of a sudden the clubhouse, after you did the pool spot, things like this is kind of on a phase 3 type of discussion, and you want a little bit more than what we've left over, that would be a reasonable thing to do at that point for that balance of what you need to do. It's a one offer and then you come in. Go ahead, Duffy, I'm sorry.
I have a question. I'm just kind of thinking, reading between the lines, both you and Katie, you had your brother would be 375, not 275.
Correct.
Why not go to it? I mean, why?
I think, well, that's what I'm going to propose. And I think that the 375 is very reasonable. I think, as Gary has said many times, 100, that 275 is the lipstick on the pig. Anything higher than the 375. I mean, yeah. But I think what you're seeing though, and that's the other thing, you could have, say the 375 gives you the $1 million to fund, but if all of a sudden the long-term planning committee convinces everyone in the next 2 to 3 months, this is a great vision. Let me show you what you could have down here. And this is what it's going to cost, because they're going to talk to the architects and actually get real numbers. And there is a number that's above that, a special assessment tied at the same time to do it, things of that sort. The problem with the special assessment though, is the way our documents are worded, that when you pass that special assessment, it has to be for defined capital improvement and it has to be completed in that budget year. So you can't pass a special assessment now, assuming you're going to spend it in a year or two. It has to be at that moment of time in that fiscal year.
Melissa, we have a Zoom question.
Yes.
So the 375 will be added to the yearly amount.
Correct. So that would be then, so for those numbers. So what that actually equates, we pay $1,780 right now. I just want to make sure I'm saying the exact numbers correctly. And so let's see where I put it. Thank you. So I do have it written down somewhere. Yeah. So it's not really that, I think, for what you can get. And then it's just, you have to decide. $1 million sounds like a lot on paper, but then you have to temper what your expectations are. And I think that's where the long-term planning comes in, because we'll rely on them to actually go to the architects, go to the engineers, go to the designers. What are they envisioning and what are some real numbers to go from there?
So it's a change of from 143 a month to 179 a month.
So 143 to
So it's-
179 a month is what the change would then be.
One other thing you mentioned about the loan.
Yes.
You know, when we look at the loan and potential rates, you know, you could probably find something for less than we currently are paying. That loan, the initial face value of the loan was what, about 900,000.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, when you combine it, you know, there's an analysis that you could do and look at it through time, because there's time value of money. And there's also increasing construction costs. You know, lumber has absolutely doubled in the last year.
Correct.
So you could restructure that loan, take the extra money that you're going to get. The loan that we're currently at is paying off almost $1 million, right? So you could restructure it, take it out over 10 years, and still be very conservative from a cash flow standpoint if you get the money, so that you can actually put the improvements in place quicker, and then, you know, have
The only reason that would change then the 275 number, because the assumption is that in October of 2023, we no longer are paying $100,000 a year in a loan payment. That's what that's what you have to budget.
No, I'm saying
So when you
it's a
then have that
375
savings, that's what I'm saying. So with the, with the 275, I'm assuming just 2.5 years worth of savings of 250,000 went in to help shore things up. That's why you can get away with 275 increase. If you continue the loan, restructure it, you're gonna have to pay more than 275 because of the loan payments that you bought yourself. It stays in the operating side, but you're also paying interest. And your interest, you're not getting any capital from, even though it's low, it's still a payment that could be unnecessary if you try the 375 number. You're still gonna almost have to go up to 375 if you take out a loan, but you now have an interest cost on top of it. This is a way to avoid the interest cost. I mean, so there's many different, and I think, you know, and this actually is great for even future discussions. I have offered one approach. I think this is a way that you don't have to pay interest. It saves the community. We're putting in the reserves. We've had a track record that we actually do what we say. We have 5 years to prove it. I think it's a good option. Loan can always be another option. Not doing it is an option. You know, they've got 3 really viable things. 500,000 brings you to 325. I think if you're 500 might do the spa here, you kind of want a global project. You want all these buildings to match. You want this to be your showcase. When you go to sell your house, you're going to show them your house. And oh, by the way, we're going to quickly come here and walk around because this is what's going to sell your home. So that's where you want to spend your money, I think. Oh, go ahead over there.
Over here.
Up. There you go. Pep.
Back to the burden rate when we were talking about.
Yeah.
this. So if our payroll is 45% of our budget, I mean, that's a large percentage of our budget. And if I want to make sure I understand this right, we pay 35% above and beyond the salary because Century takes care of the hiring of those people. Would hiring our own employees in-house be an option at all? And so, like, because we could save that 35%.
Sure. So one of the questions is Century charges, besides, you know, maintaining your books, it's also a burden rate on employees. What that comes out to in real numbers is about $38,000 for maintaining your books. And it comes out to about another, when you combine the maintenance and the 3 office staff, for about another 38,000+ is the burden rate. And then you have probably another 7,000-8,000 of these office supply charges for mailings and such. When you look at that 38,000 to maintain your own books in house, you're now running, you know, your own. It's a lot of more responsibility within the office. You're now hiring an accountant to meet with you once a month to make sure everything's on the up and up. So by the time you increase the cost of, you're now demanding more from your manager staff, so their salary would go up. You'd have to have the software to maintain it. You're now paying an accountant every month instead of just once a year to do your taxes. You've really offset that. And then also too, who's the manager? Who's the one making sure? You now have a rotating budget. Century right now is making sure everything is done and it's being audited. The bank account is balanced. We have insurance through them that's insuring our money. So there's no theft, things of that sort. To actually then, who is the one overseeing that? It comes down to a volunteer board. So I think for the safety factor long-term, you might have a rare instance where somebody's willing to take that responsibility, but in the long term, for the safety of the money of the community, it's better to have that third party.
Awesome answer. Thank you.
Sure.
We have a comment on Zoom. It says, we agree with the 375. It is a very fair amount for what we get in this neighborhood. Also, the clubhouse should rent for about $500. There are no halls out there for this little rental.
And then once again, and like I said, right now it's only 5% of our budget. There is no reason we can't shore that up and actually use that money and extra monies we get from that to shore it up, because that's one of the things I did not put in the budget. I didn't put any stable increase that we talked about, any racket club we've talked about charging pros, any increase in the clubhouse. I assumed that would be stable. And if we get it, that's great, that's gravy. And that gives you that little bit of extra buffer of the people who may not be able to meet the extra expenses of the assessment. Remember, in a given year, not 100% of people pay assessments. Historically, you'll have 10 to 15 who really are, I'll just say the numbers as of right now, we have 15 people who paid 0 out of the 879. And then you have about 140 or so that have paid maybe 300 towards your 1780. So you're never going to get 100%. So even with the 100% assessment that you will then look in the accounting ledger, you subtract out anywhere between 18 and 30, 40,000 that you're not going to collect in that given year. So you have to then take that into consideration. I ended up subtracting out of my number about 25, 30. Hopefully that's enough to make up for the offset of what people are going to not be able to pay. Go ahead, sir.
I'm new here, so this is probably a way off question. Stewards Committee, I think, is one of the committees you're on, is in design.
Long-term.
Long-term planning committee, Stuart's on.
Long-term
Mhm.
When I first drove into the Springs at night, it was like going into a dark hole.
Mhm.
The lighting along the roads is not working. In California, Palm Springs and so forth, the lighting is consistent throughout the community. And the entryway has Christmas lights around the palm trees all the time.
Mhm.
So what would it cost to, not what it would
Yeah.
cost, but how much money would we have?
It's really interesting you asked that. How much, if we're gonna play a guessing game, how much
Repeat
do
the
you think
question.
we spend? The question is lighting in the community.
Lighting, yeah.
And this actually came up at a board member. Somebody had commented that sometimes we have white lights, yellow lights, we have all different color lights.
They're not,
No. How much do you think we spend on just basic maintenance of the lights? Making sure the wire that aren't put in conduits, they're just laid in the ground that are rotting away
12,000
after.
a year.
How much do? Higher than 12. You can't answer. You know the answer. Both of you know the answer.
Higher.
It's higher. It's 30,000 plus, 35,000 of changing light bulbs and repairing wires that are in the ground. So we're spending every year back, and that's even 5 years ago. So we've had $150,000+ doing light bulbs and repairing little wires. Part of the long-term planning that are the reserves, they budgeted, I think it's about 30, 40,000 to start upgrading the lighting in the community, not just splice a few wires back together and fix the light bulbs. So that's something that I actually want to task. I've told Asher I would love on the long-term planning, really design, what do you want to do with lighting? What color do we want? Do we want solar? If we have to replace these poles and do something, now's the time to actually design what you want to do for the future. Because once again, once you fix something in reserves and pay for it, that money doesn't come back around for another 20, 30 years. So you don't put Band-Aids on things when you spend it out of reserves. It's what do you want to do for that period of time? Go ahead, Ron.
The reason for the different colored lights, the lollipop lights, as the bulbs start to fail, they get very orange. And and when they're all replaced, they're all bright white. But the other thing is the useful life of the poles is 15 to 20 years, mainly the ones around the boulevard. Probably in the next 5 years, they're going to start to fail because those are replaced between 2002 and 2010. Our 2-year lighting project lasted 8 years.
Yeah.
But the bulbs are going to start to fail.
Yeah.
But we also need to really look at upgrades to the bulb system. I mean, we're using 30-year-old technology.
Well, and also even the electrical system, series versus parallel. That's why when one goes out, 10 goes out, you don't know where it is. So there is so many under the ground issues besides just, where is water draining? How are they collapsing? Fix the road when that collapsed. The electricity system, all the lighting. The only thing that we don't own that we rent is on Lost Springs. We actually rent those lights from Duke Energy. Everything else we own. And what Ron had said, the different color lights is yellow is when they're starting to fade and die out. White is when they're a fresh new bulb and you have a good system. As the lighting has been going through, instead of just splicing things, they're now actually trying to fix how the electricity is going through to make more sense. So they're trying to do corrective measures. Now it's just going back with the person and the company we've been using to say, what did we actually fix and what's left to fix? And are we going to continue with the design we have, or do we want to change to something like solar on the poles? Go ahead, next to Kate. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
My name's Bruce.
Hi, Bruce. Hello.
I'm her uncle
Oh, there you go.
and his brother.
All good. Hello. Yes.
Anyway, you were saying 10 to 15 people haven't paid anything of their assessments, and you have a group that have only paid partial. How much is that total?
That's about, you're hitting probably right around 220 right now, I think is the ARs, is about 220,000 or so. By the end, that was not delinquent, because remember, you're allowed to pay quarterly.
Yeah.
Now, 15 truly are delinquent, and then this, lien type of notice will probably be going out to those individuals soon. We wanted to wait a little bit just to COVID has kind of complicated things a bit too. Because remember, a lot of the different laws with COVID in place, you can't do the bankruptcy, you can't, we have probably 10, 15 other people on the books who truly owe money, but we can't pursue that right now because everything's on hold because of COVID. So there's a lot of under the kind of hood type of things. So like I said, my assessment, when I looked at income, I took into account that probably about 15 every year would not pay. If that changes, once again, the income stream does change, but it's not so tight that that little bit hopefully would affect things.
How much do we make on the interest for the people who pay quarterly?
We probably sit around 30,000, 20, 30,000 a year. So quarterly actually helps the budget. But once again, when you look at what the assessments come in, 95% is not counting the interest, late fees, any of those things. 95% right now is the out and out 1780 times 879 gives you a number. That's where the 95% comes in. Yes, sir.
So how much of the, you have an aging of the receivables. I'm more concerned about what is the amount of those that are, say, over 365 days delinquent.
Those are
Repeat
the
the
ones.
question.
Yeah. So how many people are over 365 days?
How many and what's the amount?
Yeah, that actually has gone down. We have
3 to
about,
5.
what is it?
3 to 5.
Yeah, there's only about 3 to 5, probably 12 that we kind of follow, but they're all making aggressive payments. And like I said, there's not a big cash number anymore. All that settled out in 2018-19. So the ones we
So
used to
even
have
those that
about,
are severely
yeah, we used to have
delinquent are making
2.
partial payments
Yep.
to get-
There's only a couple
Yeah.
with big balance.
Yeah, we only had, we had probably 150,000 sitting out there at that point, and now we're down to maybe 30, 40,000. I mean, it dramatically increased. In 2018-19, we had an artificial increase of settlements. People, I think the housing value came up. You can't sell your house if you owe this much money in assessments. They quickly settled up. So there's a value now for people to correct their accounts, and they see that in the market. So we don't have that underlining AR to go back to like we did 2-3 years ago.
our
And that's
attorney
part
is
of it, what
very-
changed.
It is very attentive to those accounts and
Mhm.
updating us on it when anything changes. We get monthly reports from the attorney on like, here's the accounts that are due, here's the lien notices that went out, here's people who settled up, here's the
Yeah.
payment plan they suggested. They're very attentive and very.
Yeah, and that
on
is,
top of it.
yeah, and audit and finance, like I said, we audit. Audit is looking at the ledgers, and ledgers unfortunately are about, 2 months behind. So if we see something, identify something, it's not in real time, it's something that happened that we have to correct in the future. It's the account receivables, looking at how is the money coming in, who owes money, looking at those type of payment plans. And then seeing how we are on the budget and looking forward for the next year of, are we in tune to that? Yes, sir.
Has anyone ever looked into private cable as a revenue? source?
Those are all the different, once we fix, these are all things like when you fix, you're saying, can you get other monetary streams, private cable, private electricity, bringing, no longer, should we rent our lights instead of paying for our lights? That's all these different type of things are great conversations to have once you actually shore up your house. You have to have your house in order. You have to have your incomes and expenses corrected. And then you can start thinking, okay, for sustainability in the future, I'm paying this increase, but I have Melissa sitting up here and saying, I'm not going to vouch for anything past 3, 4, 5 years because I don't have a crystal ball. So when you want to start looking for other avenues to increase your income, now is the time because you have to make a commitment to that and then you can come back. So those are the things that looking forward, those are the committees you look into to see if it's viable or not. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but you have to do it. There's more to it. So you don't want to go off track before you shore up your house first. Probably just going to have just a couple more because I know everybody, it's been an hour and a half and I know people really want to get back to their
How many
Saturdays.
members are there total?
There's 879 homeowner sites that are paying into the HOA.
Okay. And how many HOAs are there in the community?
Well, there's the main board of, Springs main board that we oversee everything. And within that mainspring board, you then have the 2 different condos. You have Crown Oaks 1, 2. Yeah, so it's 6 total, Spreading Oaks, Live Oak. All those are their subcommittees, some communities within there that have their own sub HOAs. The single family homes are not under that umbrella. We're only under the main HOA. So you actually have two different things.
I got
So let's say, for example, you're in Spreading Oaks. Your Spreading Oaks dues is paying for your landscaping, it's paying for different things, but not the road going through it, because we actually, the main HOA will do that. Every village has something carved out. Some of it we pay for, some we don't, but everything is very defined. And it's all about land, easements, your members. It's not vague. It's very clear of what each line has.
Century management?
No, each, so the main HOA is under Century.
Right.
Some of the subdivisions are under Century, some aren't. And so you would have to check with your own individual one of who you're at with.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. All right, here you
And
go.
there's a question about like, how much is available in the emergency fund?
So
Repeat
right
the
now,
question.
how much is available in the emergency
Yeah,
fund?
and how much
We
do you
started off the
propose-
year, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And how much do you propose that it should be?
So when I look at the emergency fund, I'm not thinking about operating surplus. I'm thinking about a line item budgeted fund that would go through. And I'm basing it on more historical data. I'm saying 50,000 because normally you have a budget, say of 10,000 on a lot of these things that go wrong. When something goes wrong, it's a 50,000 hit to the budget. If you have more than one, if you're unlucky enough to have more than that in a given year, that's what your operating surplus is there for that one offer that happens. Some of the things like the one on Wisteria that's going down, the estimate to fix it is say 15, 20,000. So you could have 2 or 3 of those in a given year, the smaller ones. The big sinkhole, I think that was a 70,000 hit to the budget. So there are other things that happen in the springs, but that's why you average it out. You don't want to look at one point in time in a community that's aging. You want to look at the global picture, forward, back. The history is going to help you anticipate the future, but it doesn't always predict it. So you have to take some assumptions, guess, and it's always a working document. It's something you have to continue to adjust, and you try to then manage your budget accordingly. Go ahead, Duffy, and you'll be the last one. How we go?
I have one. He requires 60% approval of the members.
No, 51% for a
That's for assessment.
for an assessment,
What
for a
about the
special, for the
dues?
dues,
Dues increase.
for a dues increase is 51% of the proxy of the people that vote. So I think we need 329, I believe, for a proxy. And then of that number, 51%. If it's a special assessment, that's different. That one goes to 2/3. Correct.
51%
Of the people who vote, not of the 879, of the proxy that we need to at least make quorum, and then it's 51%. All right, I think that's probably enough for a Saturday. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
Again, everyone here, if you guys can do me a favor, thank you. I was listening on my phone. Can you guys do me a favor? Tell your neighbors though, tell the people around you that maybe they couldn't make it. That Kate had a good idea earlier about pinning this on the Facebook page, like on the very top of this video, so everyone can see this for the next 6 months. Can you guys talk to your neighbors and just kind of get the word out? So it's not gonna be a shell shock when this gets